Good morning guys, in this video we're going to go through how you can grow winter vegetables so that you can supply your own roast dinners, stews, casseroles with homegrown produce. It's worth noting that a lot of the produce you might enjoy over winter, you can grow it almost any time of year and then store it and hopefully enjoy it around Christmas time or later on in winter. However, what I'm looking at today is produce that you can pull out of the ground on a cold January day or even on Christmas Eve, ready for your Christmas dinner. Now, no roast dinner is complete without roast potatoes, and growing your own potatoes is something you can do, almost any time of the year. But potatoes store very well in a sort of cool, dark place in a sort of breathable sack or something like Hessian or sort of paper bag. However, you can grow potatoes like I have here in July, and then you'll be harvesting them sort of in any time after sort of November, and you can store them in the ground. But the key with that is that you've got to protect them from the frost. So the way to do that is to pile up a layer of mulch on top of them, such as compost, and that will protect them. The only downside to that is the longer they're in the ground, the more chance there is that they might get eaten by slugs. So you've got to sort of bear that in mind. But I'm going to harvest at least one plant here and sort of just show you what you can kind of expect from sort of potatoes sown in July. Now, the variety of potato here is Charlotte, and there are a few different varieties that are suitable sort of in July for like a July sowing. Now, what I would say, and what the only sort of downside to doing this sort of method is that potentially they could get something called blight. Now, blight happens when it's quite sort of warm and humid in the air, and you get these blight spores on the potatoes, which then goes down into the stems, and it can go into the potato. Now, all of these plants here did get a level of blight on the leaves and things, but it looks like, as I'm sort of digging these up, it hasn't really affected the potatoes too much. So I haven't found any big ones yet. A lot of these are quite sort of small new potatoes, and maybe that's what I'll sort of get. But I did grow the exact same variety at the allotment this year as well, and I did get some absolute big ones there. So I'm hoping as I dig down I might get some more and more sort of potatoes, larger size potatoes. Now I decided to dig up a second plant because there weren't too many on the first plant, but as you can see there's some pretty decent sized potatoes there, and I think these ones are maybe a little bit small because of the blight and it's all killed off the leaf foliage, whereas the ones I got at the allotment produced much larger potatoes and it didn't get blight. But as you can see here, by growing these in July, you can store them in the ground till sort of just before the first frost, or even once the frosts have started, if you put mulch over the top, and then on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve you're digging up your own homegrown spuds. Now the next one is an absolute staple of any kind of Christmas dinner or casserole or stew, and it is carrots. And again, this is another July sowing. So both the potatoes and the carrots are quite interesting because once your sort of spring sowings are coming to an end and lots of those are running out of steam and you're sort of emptying the vegetable beds, potatoes and carrots are something that you can sow in July to keep the beds full all year round. Now, these carrots here, sort of direct sown, thinned out to about 1 inch, 2 inches apart, and I'll show you how you can kind of tell when a carrot is ready to harvest. Now, carrots are brilliant because you can sort of store them in the ground and then just dig them up when you want to use them. But the way to tell when a carrot's kind of finished growing is when you see the shoulders above the soil. So when they're above the soil, that's means they're kind of ready and they're about the right size, ready to harvest. Next up on my list, and similar to carrots but different, is parsnips. Now, parsnips are beautiful when they're sort of roasted with like a honey glaze, really sweet, and one of those strange vegetables that, due to when the parsnip gets cold or touched by sort of frost or freezing weather, it produces sugars as an antifreeze, and what that means is the root becomes sweeter the more sort of cold exposure it gets. So the longer you leave these in the ground, the better and better they're going to taste when you eventually harvest them. But parsnips, unlike carrots, you're not sowing them in sort of July time. You can just sow these ones much earlier. Parsnips take a very long time to grow, and I typically sow mine in April, and I've got a sowing here that was May, which we'll take a look at to see how it's coming on. But what I will also say is I did last year do a whole video on growing parsnips from seed to harvest, which I really recommend you watch if you're interested in growing parsnips, because they can be a bit finicky, and there are a few little sort of tips that will help you grow the best parsnips possible. Now in this absolute jungle here are my parsnips, and they're also next to my daikon radishes as well, which make a separate video about at some point, but they're doing okay. Now the parsnips, one here, and I've dug around it just so you can sort of see the size of it, and yeah, this one here was an April sowing. What happened was I sowed some in April and they didn't do very well. I didn't get very good germination, so I sowed some more in May, and these are the ones that are over here. Now if I dig around here, one, I can't really feel the root. Well, I think I can. Oh yeah, I can feel the shoulders, but it's a much smaller shoulder to the parsnip sown in in April. So just a heads up, if you want really big parsnips, make sure you sow them in April and harvest them after you've had the first frost. Now the final vegetable I want to talk about is Brussels sprouts, and it's kind of a love or hate vegetable. Some people love them, some people hate them, but they are sort of synonymous with Christmas really. So I think they're definitely something that I personally as a grower really enjoy growing, and I don't mind eating them as well. Now Brussels sprouts, again, a bit like the parsnips, you've got to sow them in April. They've got a really long sort of growing time before you can sort of harvest them. So unlike things like the potatoes and the carrots that you can sort of succession plant after spring crops in sort of July, with these ones, parsnips and the Brussels sprouts, you're kind of dedicating a space to them for potentially 9-10 months. So they're a bit of a investment crop, and if it doesn't go well, it can be really frustrating. But what I'll show you here at close-up is some of these little button sort of Brussels sprouts which are forming now on this one. But over on this other one, they're much smaller. They're nowhere near as good, and that plant seems to be struggling quite a bit. Now, with Brussels sprouts, sow them in April, grow them like any brassica, but the big problem you're going to have, and the big problem I have every year, is caterpillars. I can see some baby ones on here now indicating there are fresh eggs that have been hatched, but caterpillars will typically just decimate your brassicas, so you've really got to come up with a means of protecting them. Last year I got quite lucky. I had a coriander plant which basically flowered, and I planted a coriander plant here next to the Brussels sprouts, hoping the same thing would happen again, but for whatever reason it didn't go to flower, so I didn't get any of those sort of hover flies, beneficial sort of predatory bugs which prey on the caterpillars, and that's one of the ways you can naturally keep the populations down. But Brussels sprouts is definitely one I would advise growing for your sort of roast dinners. So I really hope you enjoy this video, and as you can see, there's quite a lot of crops that you can be sort of harvesting from the ground, from outside in winter, and there are others as well, swede or rutabaga, as I think Americans call it, turnips, things like that you could also be harvesting from the ground. But I really hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you all soon for more videos.